Now that Alex Murdaugh has been convicted and sentenced to life in prison, let's do a post-mortem as to what happened and how we got here. Of course, the biggest news was that the jury returned a guilty verdict in less than 3 hours. That's not typical. We had a 26-day trial here, and normally jurors deliberate approximately 1 hour for each day of testimony. I thought the deliberations would go at least until the weekend, maybe get a verdict Friday afternoon, but more likely into early the following week. But the fact that we got a verdict the same day as closing arguments, Thursday evening, was a surprise to everyone. And it just goes to show how poorly the defense did, as well as how good of a case the prosecution put on. We've been talking about this case for a while, and I've consistently maintained that it was a very difficult circumstantial case for the state of South Carolina. So how did they turn that difficult, questionable case into a slam dunk? Well, some of the jurors have already spoken to the media, and they've given us an insight as to what happened in that jury deliberation room. The first count, within approximately 45 minutes, the vote was 9 guilty, 2 not guilty, and 1 undecided. That's a pretty strong showing for the state for the first vote. And really, this case was won by the state and lost by the defense because of Alex's testimony. We've seen a clear shift recently where criminal defendants, especially in high-profile cases, are taking the stand in their own defense. Obviously, a criminal defendant has a Fifth Amendment right not to testify, and historically, for years, criminal defendants wouldn't take the stand because they would be subject to cross-examination. But we're seeing this shift and this new trend where defendants like Kyle Rittenhouse and Elizabeth Holmes, they're testifying, and they're insisting on testifying, and sometimes it works, like in Rittenhouse's case, and sometimes it doesn't in Elizabeth Holmes's case. Part of it is, I think, there's this narcissism from people like Alex Murdaugh, who obviously is a practicing lawyer from a very wealthy and prominent family. He thought he could talk his way out of it. Same thing with Elizabeth Holmes, the youngest self-made female billionaire at the time. These are 2 very successful people, and they're not used to losing. But what they don't understand is when you take the stand as a criminal defendant, the entire case will come down to your testimony. So if you don't testify well, you will lose. And that's exactly what happened here. Alex Murdaugh not only testified, he testified in a way that made himself unlikable and not credible. And let's take both of those in turn. He wasn't likable because he admitted to stealing millions of dollars from many clients. I mean, he had to. I mean, the evidence of the financial crimes was overwhelming. But by doing so, people already don't like lawyers, especially personal injury lawyers. I'm one of them. And now you have a personal injury lawyer who's an admitted thief and a crook. That's a problem. And that's something that he couldn't get away from. Him and his lawyers seemingly thought that, hey, if we admit to some crimes but not others, maybe the juror will believe that we're not guilty of these murders. That plan backfired. But more importantly, Alex Murdaugh was not credible. So he's not likable, but when he lost credibility with the jurors, the case was lost. And really, the credibility issue came down to his lies to law enforcement. Murdaugh said that he was in the house napping and not in the kennels when the murders happened. Why is this such a big deal? You know, every state in this country, including South Carolina, has a jury instruction that says that if you think a witness is lying about one fact, if it's an important fact, you can discredit and disbelieve their testimony entirely. And that's what happened here. Alex Murdaugh lied about where he was when his wife and son were killed. So when the defense put him on the stand, they had to have an explanation for this lie, because it was clear that he lied, and the lie was revealed because of Paul's friend, who testified that he received the Snapchat video and he was 99% sure that it was Alex's voice in that video. And that video, of course, was taken at the kennels just minutes before Maggie and Paul were killed. So what was Alex's explanation? This is what the defense put up. They said he's addicted to opioids, and that created a paranoia. And he was also distrustful of law enforcement, particularly SLED. That's the state law enforcement officials there in South Carolina. Well, there was no clear connection between someone being a drug addict and, being a pill popper and, and lying or not trusting law enforcement, especially when you're a lawyer, you've been practicing for 30 years. Your dad was a lawyer and your grandfather was a lawyer. This isn't someone that lacks sophistication, hasn't dealt with law enforcement before. And that's something that the jurors that have spoken publicly, they said really factored into their deliberations. They did not believe Alex. One, and he didn't act in a way that was consistent with someone who was a grieving father and husband who had lost family members. He cared more about clearing his family name and clearing Paul's name, who was dead, or to protect Buster, who was still alive, than actually finding out who murdered his family members. The other issue was the defense. They really hammered the lack of motive, right? They said that none of the witnesses that testified said that there was any issues between Alex and his wife and Alex and his son. But they really didn't put forth a strong alternate theory. There was a clear legal defense here, or factual one. If they really kind of went into the drug use a little bit more, they really focused on some of the folks that wanted to kill Paul because of obviously the boating accident. I think they should have leaned into that more, played the case straight up. Don't put Alex on the witness stand. I'm not saying that the result would have been different because that lie still would have come out, but I think the defense would have been better served arguing the lack of evidence in this case during closing argument instead of exposing their client. And let's talk about the lack of evidence. Really, the only forensic evidence the state had in this case was really the gunpowder residue. There was some on the blue raincoat or the blue tarp, depending on what side you were on. And, there was some in his car and on his seatbelt. And there was also some ballistics evidence. Some of the bullets found on the property were consistent with the shotgun and the rifle that killed the two different weapons that were involved in the murders. But really, you didn't have a whole lot of other evidence, right? There's no DNA, there's no blood splatter. Obviously, the state argued that Alex had time to change his clothes and put on clean clothes. But typically, in a crime scene like this, you'd have a lot more evidence. You'd have good cell site evidence. You didn't have any of that. So there was no clear motive, not a lot of forensic evidence. I think there was a chance of winning this case, just a chance, if Alex didn't take the stand. But at some point in the trial, the defense got desperate. I don't know if there was the decision was made before the case started, but when all the evidence started coming in, Judge Newman allowed really two big categories of evidence: the financial crimes and the opioid abuse. The only evidence that the judge excluded was evidence of a past affair that Alex had approximately 15 years prior. So when all this bad evidence started coming in, this prior bad acts evidence, I think Alex and the defense panicked. They decided to take the stand, and of course it backfired. So now that Murdaugh's been convicted and he's gonna die in South Carolina State Prison, the question is, does he have any chance of appealing this verdict? And I think he does. I think it will survive appeal, but the defense has a pretty good argument that Judge Newman let too much bad acts evidence in. Most of the evidence in the case was really about his financial crimes. It was really a trial within a trial. And I would say there was probably even less evidence about Murdaugh and the murders themselves. So because so much prior bad acts evidence came in, it may give the appeals court in South Carolina their pause. They may want to overturn this conviction based on that. I think the opioid use, I think that's probably going to be okay. There wasn't that much testimony about the drug addiction, and ultimately it was one of Murdaugh's defenses himself, the reason for his lies. I think that's going to not be an issue on appeal. But even if there is any chance that this conviction is overturned, Murdaugh still has a huge problem. He admitted to all sorts of financial crimes, stealing more than $9 million from clients, and he admitted it under oath under penalty of perjury. The state has already said they're going to move forward with prosecutions for the fraud. So because of his age, he's in his mid-60s, and the amount that was stolen. And, when you're dealing with crimes like this, because Murdaugh was their lawyer and these victims were particularly vulnerable, we're talking about injured clients or family members who've lost loved ones, those are all enhancements. So he's going to get plenty of time for those financial crimes, and I do expect them to be prosecuted, even if there is no effect, because those victims also have a right to their day in court, a right to criminal restitution. And whether it's a case like Tom Girardi or someone like Alex Murdaugh, prosecutors have no tolerance for lawyers that steal from clients. That's really the cardinal sin. So we're going to see a prosecution for the financial crimes. even though Murdaugh's already in jail, even though it's probably not going to add anything to his sentence. And we may even see a prosecution for the staged suicide, or even the suspicious circumstances of their housekeeper's death. Obviously, that case hasn't been filed yet, but there's plenty to go after Murdaugh for. So even if he is, for some reason, in a likely event he's successful on appeal, I don't think the result is going to be any different, because he's going to stay in prison for any number of other crimes. You know, just to kind of close out, I really got to give credit to the state of South Carolina for bringing a very difficult case, circumstantial case, and for proving it beyond a reasonable doubt, because there are a lot of legal analysts, talking heads like myself, that going into this trial said it's going to be a tough case, and we didn't know whether the state was going to be able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So the fact that they did, and did so quickly, you know, I tip my hat to them. They knocked it out of the park. So thanks everyone for watching our post-mortem on Alex Murdaugh. If you like what you're hearing, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell for updates.